In the heart of the mighty Zulu Kingdom, the greatest threat wasn't an invading army from a foreign land. No, it was the ambition of two brothers, a conflict born in the shadow of a throne and nurtured by a father's shifting favoritism. This is the story of Cetshwayo and Mbuyazi, sons of a king, whose bitter struggle for power would plunge their nation into its most devastating civil war. It's a tale that ends in a horrific massacre on the banks of a swollen river, a day of slaughter that would forever alter the destiny of the Zulu people. This is the story of Ndondakusuka, the bloodiest battle in Zulu history. To understand the hatred that drove two brothers to tear their kingdom apart, you first have to understand their father, King Mpande. Mpande was the half-brother to the legendary Shaka Zulu, founder of the kingdom, and to Dingain, Shaka's treacherous successor. Mpande's own rise to power was a masterclass in survival. Considered a lesser threat by the paranoid Dingain, he was allowed to live while other potential rivals were eliminated. After Dingain's disastrous defeat by the Voortrekkers, Mpande, with Boer support, overthrew his half-brother in 1840 and became king. Unlike his violent predecessors, Mpande's reign was defined by a desire for peace. He was a diplomat, carefully balancing the interests of the British in Natal and the Boers in the Transvaal. For over 30 years, he presided over a period of relative quiet and growth, a long, peaceful breath in the turbulent history of the Zulu nation. But this long peace would, ironically, sow the seeds for the kingdom's most violent internal conflict. The problem was succession, a question that has plagued monarchies forever, and in the Zulu Kingdom, the rules were dangerously vague. The heir wasn't just the firstborn son. According to custom, the successor was the firstborn son of the king's great wife. This great wife wasn't necessarily the first woman the king married. She could be designated at any point, a political decision often delayed to keep ambitious sons guessing. It was a recipe for jealousy and plotting. Into this simmering pot of ambition were born Mpande's two most prominent sons, Cetshwayo and Mbuyazi. Cetshwayo, born around 1826, was the senior and most prominent son and, from a young age, the very picture of a Zulu warrior. He was tall, imposing, and had a natural charisma that drew people to him. He led a successful campaign against the Swazi and returned a hero. Warriors and traditional chiefs saw in him the spirit of his uncle, Shaka. To them, he was the natural heir. Early in his reign, Mpande had even presented Cetshwayo to the Boer Volksraad as his successor, an unusually early declaration that seemed to settle the matter. But a king's mind can change. As the years passed, Mpande grew wary of his son's popularity, perhaps fearing he'd be usurped. His gaze turned instead to his second son, Mbuyazi. Mbuyazi was younger, but he had a powerful card to play. His mother was a widow of the great Shaka, and Mpande argued this gave Mbuyazi a higher status. He became the king's favorite. While Mpande never officially took back Cetshwayo's status as heir, his preference for Mbuyazi was an open secret, a public signal that the succession was a contested prize. This split the royal house and the nation, creating two camps marching slowly but surely towards civil war. The division in the royal house soon fractured the entire Zulu nation. Two powerful factions emerged, coalescing around the rival princes. Cetshwayo's followers became known as the uSuthu. The name came from a successful raid where they captured Sotho cattle with distinctively long horns, and it became Cetshwayo's war cry. The uSuthu represented the traditional heart of the Zulu Kingdom. Their ranks were filled with seasoned veterans and young warriors who saw Cetshwayo as the embodiment of Zulu martial pride. The most influential chiefs, men who commanded thousands of warriors, overwhelmingly backed the senior prince. They saw him as the rightful heir and the strong hand needed to guard their traditions against growing colonial pressures. Against this powerful bloc stood the isiXhosa, the followers of Mbuyazi. Their name was a label for their loyalty to the king's chosen one, though it wasn't a formal warrior brotherhood like the established regiments. While smaller in number, the isiXhosa had a powerful supporter, King Mpande himself. The king's favor meant resources and a claim to legitimacy. Mpande even ordered his respected general, Ndondakusuka, to join Mbuyazi's cause, a clear signal of royal endorsement. But Mbuyazi's most crucial and controversial alliance was with outsiders. On his father's advice, he sought help from the white settlers in the neighboring British colony of Natal. He found a willing partner in a man named John Dunn, a Scottish settler, adventurer, and trader who was fluent in isiZulu and knew the kingdom's politics inside and out. Seeing an opportunity, Dunn sided with Mbuyazi, bringing a small but significant group of about 35 Natal border police and 100 native hunters, many armed with firearms. This was a move that shattered Zulu tradition. For the first time in a major internal conflict, one side had brought in foreign mercenaries with modern weapons. For Mbuyazi, it was a desperate gamble to counter Cetshwayo's overwhelming numbers. For the uSuthu, it was an unforgivable betrayal. Proof that Mbuyazi would compromise the kingdom's sovereignty, the presence of Dunn and his riflemen added a volatile new element to the conflict. The lines were drawn not just between brothers, but between tradition and foreign influence. The spear and the gun, the storm was ready to break. The years leading up to 1856 were a slow, agonizing descent into chaos. The kingdom was on a knife's edge as both factions engaged in a cold war of intimidation and political maneuvering. Cetshwayo, confident in his support, began to act less like a prince and more like a king in waiting. He held his own councils and gathered tribute, and his uSuthu warriors became a parallel power within the kingdom. This was a direct challenge to Mpande's rule, but the old king was not ready to be sidelined. In response, Mpande accelerated his efforts to prop up his favored son. The tension hit a breaking point with a series of provocations. At a ceremonial sacrifice, Mpande openly declared that Mbuyazi would be his successor, a shocking public renouncement of Cetshwayo's claim. The symbolic was quickly followed by the practical. In a move of calculated aggression, Mpande ordered Mbuyazi and his isiXhosa faction to occupy lands south of the Mlathuze River. This wasn't just any territory. It was the area traditionally held by Cetshwayo and his uSuthu. It was a direct invasion of his son's heartland, meant to provoke a fight. The final fatal step came in November 1856. Mpande granted Mbuyazi a huge piece of land in the far southeast, right on the border with Natal, near the lower Tugela River. The strategy was clear. Position Mbuyazi where his white allies could easily support him. At the same time, Mpande refused to meet with Cetshwayo, closing the door on any chance for peace. For Cetshwayo, this was the ultimate betrayal. He knew his father and brother intended to destroy him. Mbuyazi, with his followers, their families, and all their cattle, began the great migration south. As the isiXhosa moved, they purged the land of any uSuthu supporters, lighting the final fuse. Cetshwayo decided it was time to act. The time for games was over. This threat to his succession and his very life had to be eliminated. He sent out the call to arms, and from every corner of Zululand, warriors flocked to his banner. The mobilization was immense. An army of 15,000 to 20,000 warriors gathered, a river of shields and spears chanting for their chosen leader. This wasn't just a faction. It was the Zulu nation on the march. Their target was Mbuyazi and his isiXhosa, now encamped near the Ndondakusuka kraal, close to the northern bank of the Tugela River. The Second Zulu Civil War was about to begin. The morning of December 2nd, 1856, dawned on a scene of incredible tension. Two Zulu armies, brothers and cousins who had once fought side by side, now faced each other across the green hills of Zululand. The stage for this tragedy was set near the Ndondakusuka kraal, a place whose name would soon mean slaughter. The geography of the battlefield would play a decisive role. The most significant feature was the mighty Tugela River. In the summer season, the river was a swollen, churning torrent, nearly impossible to cross Mbuyazi, in a move of either extreme confidence or pure desperation, had positioned his entire force with their backs to this impassable barrier. There would be no retreat. His army, the isiXhosa, was vastly outnumbered. He had maybe 7,000 warriors. This force included his loyal followers, General Nongalaza's veterans, and John Dunn's small but potent contingent of hunters and police armed with rifles. Mbuyazi was gambling that the superior firepower and his defensive position could hold off the human wave he knew was coming. Facing him was Cetshwayo's uSuthu army, a terrifying spectacle of Zulu military might. Cetshwayo's force numbered between 15,000 and 20,000 warriors. More than double Mbuyazi's, these were the elite regiments of the kingdom, chanting their war cry, uSuthu, a sound that struck fear into their enemies. They were a sea of shields, brandishing their deadly short spears, the iqlwa. Before the battle, the isiXhosa made a powerful statement. They took burning torches and seared a long black line into the grass in front of them. This was their line in the sand. It was a solemn vow. They would not retreat beyond this mark. They would win on this field or die on it. As the two armies faced each other, a gust of wind blew the ostrich plume from Mbuyazi's headdress, an event later remembered as a terrible omen. The air was thick with anticipation. The rhythmic stamping of thousands of feet and the deep-throated war chants created a deafening symphony. The time for vows and omens was over. The battle for the future of the Zulu Kingdom was about to begin. The battle began not with a subtle probe, but with a full-throated roar. The uSuthu surged forward in the classic horns of the buffalo formation. The chest smashed into the isiXhosa line, while the horns swung wide, seeking to encircle their foe. But the first assault didn't go as planned. Mbuyazi's men, with their backs to the river and fueled by desperation, held their ground with ferocious courage. The line in the grass did not break. The disciplined volleys from John Dunn's riflemen tore gaps in the uSuthu ranks, causing shock and confusion. The initial attack faltered. For a moment, it seemed like the smaller army might just survive. But Cetshwayo was a patient commander. He had numbers, and he had reserves. While Mbuyazi had committed his entire force, Cetshwayo had held back his best. Seeing his first wave repelled, he calmly gave the order. The second wave was unstoppable. Cetshwayo unleashed his elite warriors, crucially including the feared fighters of the Mandlakazi clan. Fresh and eager, they slammed into the weary isiXhosa line with irresistible force. This time, the line buckled. Then it shattered completely. What had been a battle now descended into a rout, and then a massacre. The isiXhosa formations dissolved into a panicked mob. Their vow of no retreat became a desperate flight for life, but there was nowhere to go. Behind them lay the raging Tugela River. To their sides, the horns of the uSuthu had closed, cutting off all escape. They were trapped in a killing field. The fiercest fighting took place along the banks of the Tugela and a small tributary that would forever after be known as Mathambo, the place of bones. The uSuthu warriors showed no mercy, spearing fleeing men in the back. Those who reached the river faced a terrible choice: certain death by the spear, or a near certain death in the water. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, threw themselves into the river, hoping to swim to Natal. Most were swept away by the powerful current. Others were picked off by uSuthu warriors who lined the banks. Eyewitnesses spoke of the river becoming clogged with the dead, and of crocodiles feasting on the remains. Prince Mbuyazi was killed in the chaos, his body lost in the slaughter. He was not alone. 5 of his brothers, all sons of King Mpande, were also cut down. In a single bloody afternoon, Cetshwayo had eliminated nearly all his rivals. The Isixhosa faction was not just defeated, it was annihilated. The massacre wasn't limited to warriors. In the aftermath, Cetshwayo's forces rampaged through the camp, slaughtering non-combatants, including women and children, to ensure no future rival could arise from his brother's line. The death toll was apocalyptic. Thousands of Mbuyazi's followers perished. Amidst the slaughter, Dunn made a desperate escape. A strong swimmer, he plunged into the Tugela and barely made it to the opposite bank. The old general, Ndondakusuka, also narrowly escaped by swimming to safety, but they were the exceptions. For the vast majority of the Isixhosa, the Battle of Ndondakusuka was the end. As the sun set on December 2nd, 1856, it illuminated a scene of unimaginable horror. The banks of the Tugela were littered with thousands of bodies. The Mathambo stream ran red. Cetshwayo stood as the absolute, undisputed victor. Through brutal force, he had settled the question of succession. The news of the massacre left King Mpande utterly broken. He had lost 6 sons in one day, including his beloved Mbuyazi. His gamble had backfired catastrophically. When Cetshwayo presented the captured cattle to his father, the grieving king refused them and ordered him out of his sight. But his grief changed nothing. Mpande remained king in name, but the real power in the Zulu Kingdom now rested with his son. Cetshwayo was now the de facto ruler. His consolidation of power was ruthless. In the years that followed, he kept a close watch on his father's court. In 1861, believing his father's favorite wife, Nomanshali, was plotting against him, Cetshwayo ordered her and her children killed. While 2 sons escaped, the youngest was murdered in front of the horrified king, a chilling message that Cetshwayo's authority was absolute. Another half-brother, Umtonga, was forced to flee for his life. In a remarkable turn of events, Dunn, the adventurer who had backed the losing side, soon found his destiny tied to the victor. Dunn later approached Cetshwayo, and the prince, perhaps impressed by his audacity, offered him a position as his advisor. Dunn accepted, moved back to Zululand, and became a powerful chief in his own right, acting as Cetshwayo's primary link to the colonial powers. For the next 16 years, Cetshwayo ruled in his father's name. He strengthened the army and solidified his control. When Mpande finally died of old age in 1872, the transition was seamless. On September 1st, 1873, Cetshwayo was formally crowned king. He established a new capital, naming it Ulundi, the High Place, and the Zulu Kingdom entered its final defiant chapter. The Battle of Ndondakusuka was more than just a battle. It was the violent birth of a new era for the Zulu Kingdom. It was one of the bloodiest conflicts in Zulu history, a brutal civil war that left thousands dead and scarred the nation's psyche. The massacre decisively ended the succession crisis. Cetshwayo's victory was so total that his authority was never again seriously challenged from within. He ruled over a unified, if traumatized, nation. His path to the throne informed his entire reign. He had learned that power grew from the organized might of the Amabuto, the Zulu regiments. Upon becoming king, Cetshwayo immediately set about reviving the military systems of his uncle, Shaka. He expanded the army to a disciplined force of some 40,000 men and reinstilled the martial pride that was the kingdom's foundation. This renewed military power, however, set him on a collision course with the expanding British Empire. British officials saw this revitalized Zulu kingdom not as a stable neighbor, but as a direct threat to their colonial ambitions. Cetshwayo's powerful army was an obstacle that had to be dismantled. The legacy of Ndondakusuka, therefore, leads directly to the windswept battlefield of Isandlwana. The same military machine that Cetshwayo used to crush his brother would, just over 2 decades later, inflict one of the most shocking defeats on the British Army in its colonial history. The king who won his throne through civil war would lead his nation in a final, desperate war for its survival. The story of Cetshwayo and Mbuyazi is a timeless tragedy of ambition and power. The Ndondakusuka massacre is a brutal reminder that for the Zulu Kingdom, the greatest threat truly did come from within. It was an internal wound that, in healing, created the powerful military state that would ultimately face and fall to the British Empire. If you found this story of betrayal and ambition compelling and want to explore more dramatic chapters of history, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell, and let us know in the comments. What if Mbuyazi and his foreign allies had won at Ndondakusuka? How might the future of Zululand and Southern Africa have been different? We look forward to reading your thoughts. Thank you for watching.